Thank you again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Erik of the Reconsider Podcast. Links to learn more about Erik and Reconsider can be found at reconsidermedia.org or in the show notes. You can now support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon and Subscribestar. By joining on Patreon and or Subscribestar, you keep Beyond the Big Screen going and get many great benefits. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen or subscribestar.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. Another great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can also learn about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies on various social media platforms by searching for A2Z History. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you for joining me again. Beyond the Big Screen. We're going to talk about the 1988 Japanese manga anime film Akira. And I have to admit that before this, I did not love anime, but I think this movie really started to change my mind. It's a great movie that I think you get lost that you don't think of it as a cartoon as you're watching it. And I think the other mistake that I made was watching it dubbed. And this time I watched it with subtitles. And I think that makes all the difference in the world. And maybe we can talk about subtitles versus dubbing at some point. But just a really quick overview is this movie takes place in new.Tokyo in 2019. So 3 years ago, after Tokyo was annihilated by a nuclear bomb during World War III, which happened in 1988. We'll get into the ESB angle of that. But new.Tokyo is a violent post-apocalyptic dystopian nightmare where it's ruled by street gangs, ineffective and corrupt government and police, and just layers of government, and just this huge built-up post-apocalyptic nightmare. But there's some different aspects of that we can get into. But it's basically, in this movie, we have riots, ESP, science fiction, and all the great things that are fun. Erik, maybe the first thing we can get into is this anime manga? What's the difference? Magma?
Liquid hot magma. So I'm not a anime manga buff in the way that a lot of people are. But here's the good news. So you'll see a lot about Akira the anime and Akira the manga, and you're like, are these being used interchangeably? It turns out they're two different things. So Akira the anime, is animation. So if it's animated, if it's like a cartoon, it's anime. It was made in 1988. It's based off Akira the manga that was written. So manga is like a comic book written in 1982. So Akira the anime is it is shorter, and the plot diverges substantially from Akira the manga, much like Blade Runner and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and 2001: A Space Odyssey the movie versus 2001: A Space Odyssey the book, right? Like, so we see it's interesting. Like, you and I think it's because you asked me what movies I want to watch. Like, we're seeing like the theme I've got here. But yes, Akira the anime, 1988, mostly, it somewhat sticks to the first half of Akira the manga, 1982, and like one of the, like, Akira the anime is not necessarily for everyone. It is I think it is a landmark, and like it is historically incredibly important. Much in the same way that, like, I don't know if 2001: A Space Odyssey is even for everyone. Like, some people are just gonna get bored out of their skulls. Now, I think it's probably a sign of the times that you get bored out of your skull watching 2001: A Space Odyssey, like too much TikTok and other short film. But But I think Akira similarly is not for everyone because like the plot is almost incoherent. And I wanted to get your impression, Steve, because I know when we talked about this, you're like, I don't even like anime. And like, this is a weird, like there's a lot of weird anime out there. This is like a super weird anime. And so I'm glad you liked it, but what was your like, I want to know like, what was your first impression as soon as you're done, right? As soon as like Tetsuo like starts the Big Bang, right? In this new universe that was just created somehow. Like, what did you walk away thinking?
It's an absolutely confusing movie. There's so much going on, and there's different aspects of it that I really loved, and then there were some that I kind of had to muscle through. Like, I think that the investigating the society, that was really cool, and like with the gangs and their interactions with the police and that vocational school that they went to, there were certain things like if they had curated it, I would have curated it more in those directions. I think a lot of the stuff with the ESP got very confusing and kind of weird, especially that last scene, which was the one guy like kept like turning into different blobs and like, yeah, and absorbing. And that was hard to wrap your mind around. And that's one of the... Yeah. And so those were some of the areas that I was hoping that you might be able to walk us through a little bit more. And I think that I really liked the part of it that you got lost in it, that it was through big chunks of the movie, you did not think that you were watching something animated. Like the animation was so not what I was expecting in anime. And maybe some of the more like kid-focused anime that I've seen in the past, where this was an adult movie, not adult movie. It was a mature movie for adults. It was not a child's cartoon.
No, it's super not. Yeah, and I think that, and there's a lot of animation that we watch that is either for children or for both, right? Like every Pixar film we ever watch, and I think I've seen them all, and I would like love to do a Pixar film with you someday. They're great, and they're like really, they can be appreciated by any adult, but they can also be appreciated by any kid. This is not for kids at all. Do not show this to your children, right? It's a little like that time that like someone got mad. Like some parents got mad because they took their kids to see Deadpool, and they're like, "Oh, this is effed up." Like if there was some way to like warn us that like a superhero film would be effed up. It's like, yeah, it had an R rating, lady. Like, come on. But yes. So similarly, like this seems to break out of the genre a little bit, and in some ways that's true. But what's interesting about anime is that it's such an art form. It is an art form that has a lot of so I'm like, I find myself kind of defending it sometimes, much in the same way that I defend metal. People are like, oh, metal, it's just like grates on the ears. It's like, yeah, some metal, but like it's a very diverse genre. And so a lot of the anime that like if you're not into anime that you get exposed to around the edges, it's like Dragon Ball Z or
Pokemon. I don't know if that's anime as such, but it
is anime. 100%. Yeah, Pokemon is designed for kids. And this is a like totally different beast. And then you've got like Studio Ghibli stuff like Spirited Away or Princess Mononoke that's like for both adults and kids. But this is hardcore, very, very, very gory, like to the point that a lot of critics are like, I love the movie. It just like literally made me sick. Right. I don't know. That's I guess the reason I'm bringing all this up is that it's Akira is also much in the same way that Blade Runner was, 2001: A Space Odyssey was. Akira is such an innovative movie that other anime in the future keeps leaning back on Akira. And being inspired by Akira. A good example is an anime I like called Neon Genesis Evangelion, which like we're not going to get into that, but like it leans back on a lot of like the same the same kind of techniques used. Like one of the things that makes Akira so compelling is the music they choose, right? We're in this like really dark hyper future, like hyper techno future, but we're using this haunting old traditional style of Japanese music. like that you'd imagine you're hearing in like medieval Japan. And that clash of this that clash like encapsulates like the very human parts of us clashing with this very inhuman, very it's cyberpunk, right? So it's over mechanized, it's over technologized, it's a hyper consumer culture. Although even worse than that, it's just a hyper hedonist culture, right? Like there's this old man disgusted when he sees like teens putting their hands down each other's pants, like on a park bench and stuff like that. And so I love that the music kind of encapsulates the human part of us clashing with this like very
one thing that I think
nature.
with this movie is, and with most foreign movies, is it would be you wonder how much cultural context is built into it, that not being Japanese myself, and presumably you're not Japanese, and not steeped in that culture. I think that would probably, because it was a film that was intended for a Japanese market, and I don't think that it was in any way modified to maybe fit more American tastes or Western European tastes. I think that there's probably a lot buried in there of commentary on Japanese society as well.
There's something I've noticed in anime is that there's a much greater comfort in individual characters representing something, and just like they represent this concept or this notion or this like philosophy is often it. They will like represent a particular philosophical idea, and often they'll just like they'll just say it, right? They'll just what's the word? Not expectorate, that's spitting, but whatever. They'll just say what their philosophy is, and like that's who they are. And so they act in ways that seem very strange, and we're like, man, Japanese people are weird. And it's less that and more just like Japanese people are like Japan is a very different place from the US. So if you go to Japan, you could be like, people do act in ways that are like unexpected to, but it often like the characters are acting in such strange ways that you're like, is this how Japanese people think humans work? And the answer is often no. And that's one thing we need to know, is that these humans are representing an ideology or a philosophy. But it is also the case that, yeah, you're right. Like, Japan went through this hyper growth and hyper techno revolution after the Second World War. One thing we have to know is, like, in Japan, during the Second World War, in order to try to create enough fighter planes to keep up with the United States, like while taking on the, let's just call it a Godzilla right? And there's a reason Godzilla is a Japanese thing, right? But like while trying to take on like the unstoppable monster who's like going to come and destroy your entire island, right? While trying to take that on, the fighter plane factory, the one fighter plane factory that was left after the US started bombing Japan, they had run out of gas for trains. And so they were literally hitching fighter planes up to mules and dragging the fighter planes using mules across a part of Japan so that they could like get to, the airbase and launch. And like, and so like a lot of Japan, Japan, like once it opened to the West, like after the Great White Fleet, it started mechanizing quite quickly, but even up through Japan, Second World War, it was like kind of technologically behind the West, and then it raced ahead, right? And in the 80s, when this manga and anime were made, it was ahead of the United States. And so you have to like, one of the things we have to appreciate is that, because then like the 90s is when the great stagnation to the Japanese economy happened, but Japan was on this like radical exponential trajectory, and like everyone was buying Japanese electronics and Japanese cars. And so, and it, Americans, like one of the reasons Western cyberpunk, everything's Japanese, right? Like Blade Runner, everything's Japanese. And it's because we thought like, oh gosh, Japan is just going to take over the world. This is made in, so what's the commentary going on in Japan? Like to some extent, we're projecting out a little bit, or like the director's projecting out a little bit. What could happen if we just continue this very high speed path? And as we know from all sorts of the problems we're having right now in this 2019 and slightly later time period that we're in, it is the case that hyper technologization actually messes with people. right? We start acting in ways that we don't want to. I mean, the internet and social media are the examples that we need. And so I do think Akira is exploring that a lot. What happens if this pace doesn't slow down? And Tetsuo is actually, I think, an allegory of that. What happens if this pace of change gets out of control?
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I didn't think of that until right now, that 1988 was really like peak Japan, where there was all this fear that Japan was going to take over the world. That's a lot of the books came out, books and movies. I think it was called Rising Sun from Michael Crichton. The book and the movie are set in that time-ish period where everybody is terrified of Japan and that they're going to take off and their economy is going to subsume everything. And it's kind of interesting that this movie would come out where it's Japan fighting with that, or having conflict with that, but they also have the society, and it's shown in the movie where the higher up you go in these mega skyscrapers, there's plazas with commerce and people enjoying themselves. That's clearly where the rich live. And then towards the bottom, that's where the underbelly is, and the industrial and the post-apocalyptic live.
Yeah. And Akira set the stage. So one of the reasons it's so influential is that it deeply influenced cyberpunk as we know it today, but also Japanese cyberpunk, the subgenre. Really, everything is some sort of iteration off of Akira. And so we know from stuff like Blade Runner, or even I hate this film. I'd love to review Snowpiercer with you just to tell you why it's the worst film ever made. If you're willing to do an episode like that. Yeah, exactly. And, oh God, garbage. But this sense that at the bottom or at the back are the poor people and at the top or the front are the rich people. Very cyberpunk. And we see it in Blade Runner. We even see it in Mad Max Fury Road, right? The Citadel is at the top of this rock. And so a lot of the stuff that we take for granted was developed in these notions that we take for granted were developed in the 80s. And the other thing, what's interesting is the other thing that I think we see is not just this very physically stark inequality, but we also see that at the bottom, everyone, all these gang members, the capsules, the clowns, and all the people doing drugs and stuff like that, they've abandoned the old Japanese way, this Bushido way, right? And the myth of Bushido was if you listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, he's actually talking, he's wrapping up Supernova in the East about Japan, and he makes this case that the myth of Bushido culture was a big part of why of some of the ways that Japanese soldiers acted during World War II that were so awful and horrifying and weird to us. But there is this sense, and there was this sense that that for a long time, for a very, very long time in Japan, there were traditions that were pretty immutable, right? Up into the Second World War. There were ways of doing things that were pretty immutable. This and it wasn't just the Bushido way, but we can use that as a shorthand for these Japanese traditions, which are again represented by the music. But at the bottom of this, at the underbelly of this society, absolutely everyone has abandoned these traditions, right? And they're they've gone headlong into deep hedonism. Whereas at the top, you still have this to some extent that kind of repressed culture. Everyone is even when they're talking about oh yeah, this kid Tetsuo might blow up the entire city, right? Everyone's comparatively pretty chill because that's the Japanese way of doing it. It's not the British Parliament where everyone's rah, 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 right? It's the Japanese way. It's calm. It's but it's very stern. And so I think we also see this idea that the wealthy and elite have held on to some of the Japanese traditions, whereas the most of society has abandoned them entirely, in part because their lives are so garbage. And I think it's very interesting. Like, I do really think that most of what this movie is doing to me is exploring how this traditional society, in the sense that it values tradition, right, which is Japan, how it clashes with change, with radically fast change. I think that's like that. If there's like one theme to this movie, it is that.
And that's really, I think that is probably the thing that makes this a great movie. There's so many movies that you watch and they speak just to that time frame, where I think that somebody watching it in 1988 would take something quite different out of it than somebody from the mid-90s to the 2000s to today. You can really approach it from many different angles, and you can really, it speaks to you, to your time, which makes it classic. And like with 2001, you can take those themes and they scale, I guess you could say, to different time periods. And I'm sure people in 50 years would be able to watch that movie and get something out of it. Maybe let's talk about, I think one thing that I had a question about, and I thought that was really interesting, was that whole thing with the general or the colonel. Did they call him the colonel, I believe? He was a very interesting character. What did you think about him?
So this is Shikishima, I think. He's in charge of like I think Colonel Shikishima. He is in charge of the military facility that's holding Tetsuo and the other like ESP folks. Well, he's in charge of the people in charge. And he's of course, what's happening in the movie is he notices that Tetsuo has these like really radical ESP powers. And what's really interesting, just to look back real quick, you mentioned that Akira takes place in new.Tokyo after new.Tokyo was annihilated by a nuclear bomb during World War III in 1988. That's what happens in the manga. And there's like, they just very slightly allude to Akira having been the source of the explosion in the movie. So at least my takeaway was that Akira was the reason for the explosion as opposed to a nuclear bomb. Although, like, to some extent it doesn't matter because, of course, this is all a big allegory for Japan getting nuked twice, right? Like, there's a reason 2 big bombs go off over new.Tokyo here, right? And it's because, like, Japan is still reeling from the trauma of being nuked twice. And the shock from that. But and trying to, through art, find some explanation for it. But anyway, I'm not answering your question. So Shikishima is like really concerned that Tetsuo is going to like create another cataclysm. So he's trying to advocate to Parliament that like we need to kill this guy. Like, we just need to kill him. And then, of course, Tetsuo escapes, and Shikishima freaks out. And then once Shikishima gets his hands back on Tetsuo, because Tetsuo starts losing control of his powers pretty quickly. It's just these telekinetic powers are too much, right? It's clear that, like, Shikishima has a psychic military force, right, that is, like, disciplined and trained, and probably takes a lot of training to, like, have your psychic powers not destroy you the way that they do Tetsuo. And so like Shikishima is he's this very ruthless, relentless person, obviously, who's like, taking these folks with the SP, and he sees them as either like assets, like, can I turn them into assets for the military, or do they have to be like imprisoned or destroyed? And we see Shikishima order his like ESP, his telekinetic military group to try to kill Tetsuo, and oops, it's too late. Tetsuo's gotten too powerful, and then like all hell breaks loose. And the beginning of the end happens, but he ends up staging a coup because he's basically looking for, once Tetsuo gets out, he stages a coup because he's like, someone needs to do something or Tetsuo will destroy all of new.Tokyo. And so he's just like, great, I'm just gonna take over now. So he's this delightfully ruthless character who seems to like still hold on to a lot of old Bushido, culture and tradition, and some old Japanese tradition. He's like not a hedonist, right? And what else do I want to say about him? I think I'll pause there because I feel like you picked up on something about Colonel Shikishima in particular that you want to share.
Yeah, I thought that he was really interesting because, like you said, he ties into that traditional role of the Bushido and the what you picture like a Japanese military person to be, that they're stoic, they're take control. But he also, like, his whole character, that's one thing with the movie, is things aren't drawn to perspective, and he's so big compared to the other characters. And I think they seem to play with perspective, and I don't know if it's something that they were actually doing, but like those ESP kids who look like old people. I think the one was Ryoko, and there was the two other ones, and they're so small. I thought they were playing with something with a lot of that, like characters that they were playing on the doctor. They were doing a lot of things with perspective, I think, in this movie.
Yes. I didn't even think about that. And what I did think about, I'm actually looking at a picture of the guy right now. He looks a little bit like he's out of G.I. Joe.
Yeah. Yeah. Like they're trying to say something through that, or that he's maybe like, he almost has like an American military haircut.
He does. Yeah. In a way that, like, definitely, the if you look at, like Hirohito and oh my gosh, what's the guy from Tora? Anyway, the like World War II guys, they didn't have that. Yamamoto. Yeah. So yeah, he's definitely like more Americanized. And I now that I'm thinking about that, what is the implication of that? Man, I have no idea. But yeah, it definitely, yeah, there's a reason they did it, and there's a reason he's so big, and that these ESP kids are so small, and clearly like the espers or the ESP, wielders, clearly they represent like the future, right? They clearly represent like what is happening to humanity as technology marches on and it becomes a bigger and bigger part of our lives. I mean, like, you can see it in Tetsuo quite literally, that like his body becomes very robotic, or at least part of it. It's this like horrible biological robotic mix, and that wiry fleshy mix ends up killing Shikishima. But yeah, the like, it seems like the espers have, like, their bodies have regressed, and they're very childlike, and but they're childlike but old at the same time, right? And so, like, are they children? Are they ancient? We have no idea. But, like, what they aren't are, like, these big, healthy adults, the way that Shikishima is. So, like, you couldn't have more contrast between them. And I, maybe I'll have a thought as to, like, what to make of that. But is it intentional? Absolutely. And is there, like, do I think that it means that the director or the animator or the, and the author originally felt like the traditional ways were healthy, like fundamentally healthy, and like life nourishing, and that the like new ways are unhealthy and like degrading to life and degrading to like growth and, human growth and human prospering? Yes, I do. Like, I do see that, like, you want to be, like, whose body do you want to be in? You want to be in Shikishima's body.
Is this ESP? So ESP's extrasensory perception, and different films can take that in different directions. And clearly they had telekinesis powers and powers to affect their environment with their brain. Do you think that this is the ESP is really a metaphor for people having individual power that can affect the environment and affect the society, and society losing control over the individual? Because I mean, at least from my perception, Japan, especially like old school Japan, was a lot more of it can be loaded, but a collectivist society, or a society that it's not the rugged individualist is not the key to their society.
Right. Yeah, I never thought about that. Or rather, I have thought about that regarding Japan. And like, man, I realize we're gonna get in a little bit of trouble with this film because we're making a lot of like generalizations about Japan. And so I guess like the disclaimer we have to make is that like any generalization about any society ever is strictly speaking wrong. Right? Like, it's just like the map is not the territory, right? And if you want a map to truly accurately convey a territory, it has to be the size of the territory. right? So anytime you make a map of something, like, it's wrong. You've missed important details. And so that's what we're doing. Much like if you say anything about Americans, it's like, well, there's 350 million of them and they live across a giant continent and they can't get along. So, like, when you say Americans in a word, like, whatever you say after the word Americans must be wrong, right?
Yeah, and I think that we're also coming to it from our perspective on their perspective. So I think that that is important, especially for largely what I would imagine as an English-speaking audience, American, Western European, that we're going to perceive this culture. And I think that Japanese culture is so fascinating because you can tell that there's something else going on there, and it's just completely rich with context. But because you don't have the context, you really can't burrow into it. You can just tell that there is something going else, and I'd love to learn more about it.
Yeah, that's really well said. Like, part of what our audience is getting today is not a lesson in Japanese society, but a lesson in Western perceptions of Japanese society, which is kind of cool. So let's just embrace it and roll with it. So, what was the question? Oh, right, yeah. So is this a case where you get this sense that Japan's, like, tradition, our perception of traditionalist and more collectivist society is losing control of the individual? I mean, I don't know, but it sounds compelling, and it's certainly the case that, I think it's self-evident that even before the ESP stuff, look, the fact that there are, like, gangs running around, that everyone in the seedy underbelly is, like, hedonistic, doing drugs, and that there's, like, deep corruption in the government and stuff like that, like, this is clearly a society that has lost control, right? And so, like, are the folks with ESP, especially Tetsuya, are they like an extension of that, like an allegorical extension of that? I'd be surprised if they weren't.
I also, to go back to a point you had made earlier, I think that this, and it's not so stark as, say, a Pixar movie where they've made it for children and adults, but I think that it just is a necessity that they've made a lot of the things with the ESP they made probably just to be cool, to capture more audience, like a lot of, like, it's not exactly graphic, but it's like a lot of bright lights and bells and whistles it's an action movie, but it really does clearly dig into deeper points here. So although it's not made for children, it's adults of all interest levels can definitely grab onto something in this movie.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think, like, the one thing, like, you're not gonna really get out of this movie is, like, a really truly coherent plot. I mean, it's a sequence of things that happen that you can follow, right? And the short version is, like, society, motorcycle gangs, Tetsuya crashes into someone with ESP powers and then gets them, and, like, then this is actually a movie about Tetsuya, and Tetsuya gets, like, the government shows up and captures the trying to run away ESP person and Tetsuya and the capsules, who are a motorcycle gang. And then, like, there's actually a breakout and then a return to prison and attempt to kill Tetsuya, and then, like, but because they tried to kill Tetsuya and fail, Tetsuya is now totally unleashed because Tetsuya is like, okay, the whole world is out to destroy me. And what's interesting about ESP is, of course, like, your state of mind affects it, right? And because he doesn't have, like, the discipline to control his own mind, like, his anger and his rage cause him to just, like, one, start murdering everybody, and two, grow into this, like, if you've not seen it, this unimaginably grotesque horror show of a, like biomechanical,
it's really inexplicable
not even demon, like, I don't even know, like, monster, right? And, yeah, like, you have to see it, and and then like, there's a fight with the army, but it's too late, right? It's just too late. They try to stop Tetsuya. They even blast Tetsuya with a, like, laser from space, and all they do is piss him off, right? So, like, Tetsuya in this way is a lot like Godzilla. Like, this whole, like, in the Godzilla movies, like, they keep trying heavier stuff against Godzilla, but they just tick him off more and more. But the difference is, it's Tetsuya's own, like, Tetsuo's own like rage and I don't know, and just general lack of control, like then causes him to, in this way that it's clearly extremely painful and terrible, morph into this exploding thing. And then the ESP kids come and basically like, he tries to find Akira because Akira can help him, but Akira is actually a bunch of jars now in this cryo chamber. And then it's like, it's too late. There's nothing you can do. And there's a big explosion, and like the ESP kids kind of like take him to another universe because like, I don't know, all that ESP power actually is a big bang. And new.Tokyo is destroyed, and the people who are left have to like deal with the fact that like they got nuked. And so that's the plot, right? And it's like, why this any like, and I think as Western audiences, we often expect a plot to have like, oh, it's like, it's your character or your choices that lead to, this very Greek style of tragedy. If it's going to be a tragedy, it's got to be a Greek tragedy. Your choices led to this, right? Or your character or your flaws led to this. Whereas like with Tetsuo, it's just like, he didn't want any of this. It just happened to him, and it just happened to new.Tokyo. So for a Western audience, it seems very much like a series of things that happen. Whereas, like, I think we'd see, and like how much of it is an allegory for the Second World War, I don't know, because from my Western perspective, I can't help but see the Second World War for Japan as a Greek tragedy. That like their own arrogance and their own desire to dominate, right, led to their downfall necessarily. And so, of course, I see the Japanese experience in the Second World War as a moral tale. But, if this is, given that, again, new.Tokyo gets nuked twice in Akira, how much is this an allegory for the Second World War? I don't know, but it's definitely not a moral tale. It's definitely a tale of the world is spiraling out of control, and you have these people becoming like doing everything they can and like abandoning morality in order to try to control it and failing.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, there's so much to pick apart there, especially in that there's a clear antagonist-protagonist for a while, and then it flips. So the Colonel is the antagonist in that whole thing, and Tetsuo is our good guy. But then his friend Canada comes more clear into the story, and it flip-flops where Canada becomes the good guy and Tetsuo is the bad guy, and that whole dynamic flips, and you're cheering against Tetsuo now, and you're for Canada, and they build that whole backstory, and you can see, I think that point you made that this has hit Tetsuo, this power, and he's a young kid. He's clearly a teenager or under 20. Do they ever say his age exactly? I don't think they do. It's just, so you're putting that great power, and he's growing into that great power that he has, and it's clearly way too much for him to control, and it plays through his mind, this relationship who he had with his friend Canada, who's Canada's like his proxy parents, because they're all orphans in this orphan school. That orphan school has to have a connection to something cultural or contextual too, because that seemed to come through with a lot of baggage attached to it.
It's a good point, and I haven't put a lot of thought. And what does it tell us about? What does it tell us about it? Because we only learn about, if I recall correctly, we only learn about the school actually later, like during this kind of during this kind of like ESP supported background information exposition scene, right?
The ESPers too, the old ones, the young/old ones, they were orphans as well, I believe. And so that clearly this society has a major problem of adults dying, and they don't really get into that, but it's a society that's built on very loose foundation.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're right. It's actually like it it tells us so much. Yeah, it tells us so much with so little by these kids being orphans and by them like essentially being raised by this school. And what's hard is like I'm trying to think about like does the school have an impact on the impact on the plot in any meaningful way? And I can't think of it, which doesn't mean much. But to your point, yeah, it's a sign that it's another sign that like society is like fraying at the edges as it becomes like denser and denser and denser. And that I think one of the things about traditionalist societies, and for the record, like the United States was one, right? And we're actually still grappling with that. We're very much grappling. And when traditionalist societies like lose these mores that are like very foundational, like it can be very frightening. And it's not even clear to me how that story ends. And you're right. Now that I think about like why, do we have an explanation for why there are so many orphaned kids? I have no idea. And how, the state fails to help them, right? Why do they end up in motorcycles? Because that's not a Japanese phenomenon, right? To the Japanese, that's a very American phenomenon, right? Because the Japanese looked at the United States in the 70s and 80s. That was peak violence in the United States, was the 80s, right? Like the United States was never more violent than it was in the 90s. And it's all been downhill from there, which thank goodness. So they're looking, they're clearly pulling a lot of stuff. And maybe they're just imagining that like the United States is just a more advanced, the 80s United States is a more advanced, it's advanced in the sense of like cancer gets more advanced, right? It's a more advanced version of this like declining, degrading society where like crime becomes more, just a more defining part of crime and hedonism become a more defining part of what it means to live there. Because I think one of the things that's really interesting, if you see a lot of anime, one thing you notice in Akira is that there are a lot of like American concepts brought into it. And you have this like really cool clash, especially like when the gang is riding through new.Tokyo and like looking up and seeing all the advertisements, right, for like alcohol and sex and stuff like that. There's some stuff that, again, doesn't feel very Japanese there, and a lot of stuff that does feel very Japanese, but definitely like the crime and biker gangs and like chains, like people with chains like slinging them at each other and stuff. That's very American. And I wonder if some of what we're seeing is just stuff that seems a little subtle to us because we live in the United States, but it's very profound to the Japanese viewer because it's essentially a warning that like you're going to become like America if you're not careful.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. We focused in on the 80s and our popular culture of how much Japan was impacting our culture with Japanese cars and anime, like, oh, that's, Japanese stuff. And people reacted against it. But it's very likely that they're reacting against the Americanization, or at least maybe commenting on it in this film, the violence, the commercialism that struck against their traditional culture. That's really cool.
Yeah. So, and that maybe, that now that the more that I think about it, it's amazing how much like, as we just talk about this, I kind of like discover more about I discover more about the movie. But like, I mean, look, Japan is a great like adapter society. Like they take, all throughout their history, they have seen stuff from like China and from Korea and from the United States and from Britain, and I go like, oh, that's cool, we'll do that. But like one thing they haven't adapted, so like, you have like Japanese heavy metal, you have Japanese like, all sorts of stuff that you'd see in the West, but like in little niches, right? There's like tons of niche subcultures in Japan, but like you don't have like a motorcycle culture en masse the way you do in the United States. It's just not there. And so definitely in 1988, this idea of like motorcycle gangs, that's gotta be. And I think that and it's frightening, right? It's got to be. I mean, this is a movie that like there's a lot about Japan's past that's terrifying, and a lot about Japan's potential future that's terrifying in it, and like. I can only imagine being a Japanese person seeing this in 1988 with all the allusions to the destruction of the Second World War, and like maybe not grappling so much yet with the fact that like Japan's like ultra Bushido at least mythology led to that destruction. But especially if that like connection isn't there, looking at that and then looking at what's happening to the United States at the time, and going, oh my God, like the future is just super. And that's the whole cyberpunk. Like, as much as I hate to say it, the whole cyberpunk genre, as much as I love it, is bleak. It's the bleakest of the punks, right? And so, you know, and people are like, what are the other punks? There's all sorts of punks. There's atom punk, there's diesel punk, there's steampunk, which you've heard of. There's all these different punks, which are aesthetic notions of the future. Some of which are purely aesthetic, like diesel punk, purely aesthetic. Cyberpunk really is an exploration. It is one vein of sci-fi. It is one vein of exploring where the future truly could go. And like as much, and what does it predict? It predicts hyper-consumerism. It predicts hyper-inequality. It predicts like environmental destruction. It predicts like a breakdown of our mores, right? And like morals and foundations. Mass stratification of society, dehumanization of individuals, like, technology integrating deeper and deeper physically into our bodies, as well as like every moment of our lives, and like us just being dehumanized through that process. And like, oh my God, the stuff that was made in the 80s, like the predictions are pretty good. Right? Some of the stuff is like 30, 35 years old. And we're starting to look around and be like, oh, like that was a little too on point, wasn't it?
I think that 1988 time period I think it's huge for a movie like this, because you figure like somebody who's like 30 in 1988 watching that, who was born in 1958 in Japan. Could you imagine? So clearly their parents were in World War II, and their parents are pretty young at that point. Like to see the entire change of a society that's happened in that time period. And I think probably somebody in the US or in somebody today who's in that 30-ish time period has probably seen some sort of change that's similar to that when you're a kid. And I'm a little bit older than that. So I think just being that little bit older than that completely changes my perspective. Like I think you're maybe about 10-ish years younger than I am. And so I was
I'm 34
22 like when 9/11 happened, and you were 12. Yeah, that's a big difference in perspective. And the technology that changed so much in somebody who's in that 20s to 30s range, how much technology changed in their formative years. I think that's probably the audience that they were steering Akira towards in 1988. Like people who have seen so much change in their lives and don't have that same perspective of somebody who's older than maybe, getting into like upper 30s, 40s and above would see what their perspective is on that change.
Yeah, I imagine. And the, because what's happening in the late 1980s, well, you're getting, you're over that 30 years, you've gone from, even if you're living in Tokyo, your home is kind of quiet, right? In the 1950s, like your home is pretty quiet. Like maybe there's, you might have a radio and there's probably some cars outside driving around. It's the 50s. But by 1988, you've got TV and it's probably on frequently. You've got you've got your Walkman, right? So you're listening to tapes on the go, right? So like this is the first time people start wearing, and again, it's ubiquitous now, but it's the first time people start wearing headphones as they're outside, where they're listening to something besides the world around them as they're walking around, which is very interesting. And so like technology, and like we could keep going about these different ways that technology is starting to like wrap around people like a cocoon in the 80s. And this has got to be a reaction to that.
Yeah, and the technology, the individualism, the absolute rapid change, and people like Tetsuo has to deal with it. It's him. Canada has to deal with it. I think it's Kaya. She has to deal with it because they're young. Where the colonel and the town council and the doctor, they have to suppress it because they're on the rocket ride, whether they like it or they don't, but they don't like it.
Yeah, they are very, very, very much trying to either constrain it or crush it, and and they fail. Right, that's such a big part of, if we follow this allegory, the fact that they fail and fail so catastrophically, and it's their very attempt. So this is maybe where the Greek tragedy, the more Western style tragedy part comes in. It's the Tetsuo is just a victim, but like the true tragic figure is the colonel who like ends up getting eaten by Tetsuo, right? Like, who tries to kill Tetsuo multiple times and fails, and every time he tries to kill Tetsuo just makes things worse, right? And like increases Tetsuo's like rage and alienation and fear, in order that like Tetsuo it loses control and then literally explodes, right? And oops.
Yeah, that has to be the allegory, that whole chunk of the movie, that they're just trying to destroy him, yet he just gets stronger. That has to be an allegory for technology and societal change, that it's going to change. And it almost is that the bleakness that we can't change it, and then we're ultimately headed towards chaos and destruction. They don't really give us a path in this movie that there's anything, no matter how corrupt the city is, how it's run, or the difference in lifestyle between the people who live at the top and the people who live at the bottom. This movie, I don't feel, at least, or I didn't get out of it, that they gave us a pathway out of that.
I don't think Cyberpunk really ever does. I think Cyberpunk always it predicts rather than prescribes, right? And it is in part because like anything that talks about a pathway out is ultimately utopian, right? It's ultimately making a case that there like is some sort of specific moral good and that we can achieve it. And by the way, here's how, and that's the prescriptive. Whereas the cyberpunk genre is purely predictive, and it just predicts something bleak every time. Like Blade Runner, terrible society to live. Not interested, right? Or rather, interesting, but not interested. I'm not interested. Akira, somehow even worse. And the like horror that people have to deal with is somehow it's unbearable, right? I'm even just like, you see my eyes drifting. I'm just like looking at some like gifs of this world, and it's almost unbearable to imagine living in this. Like I don't know if I would, I don't know if like, I mean, in Japan, suicide is a huge problem, and I don't know if it was in the 80s. But because it was also the case that in the 80s, like people were working themselves to death, much like in Cyberpunk, right? People who work for corporate, like definitely the idea of like the corporate man, where like all your life you're chained to the corporation, you work 80 hours a week until you die, right? Like that's a very Japanese thing. And so it may be the case that like the authors, I know we've mentioned this already, but like that the original author like went for the cyberpunk genre because they just saw an unstoppable trend towards misery, and a society that like nobody would want to live in, which is why everyone does drugs all the time, because they're trying to escape from it. Anyway, bleak, but a great movie.
Yeah, I think that's really probably the takeaway of this movie, and really it ties into Blade Runner as well. I think we always want to see what's the resolution. How do we come out of this better? And dystopian, a lot of times that genre says there is no getting out of it better. Not 1984, A Brave New World. That's about as bleak of an ending. Like if you don't throw that book across the room when you read that last scene.
I agree. I mean, 1984, it's also a very bleak ending. But and it's like, that's the thing. It doesn't. There's always multiple ways of looking at history, and we're getting quite philosophical here. One of them is that it doesn't always work out, right? It just doesn't. Like the Mayans destroyed themselves; they're just gone. The people who built the Easter Island heads, gone. All of them died, right? But the other way of looking at it is that there's never an ending. And so to some extent, like no matter how bad it gets, well, unless we actually destroy all humans on Earth, which we could do, but it'd be very hard, right? Be very hard to do. But unless you do that, like it also just keeps going, right? And so there's never an end state. Everything is always a transition between something and something else. So even cyberpunk, even the cyberpunk dystopia, is a transitionary time, right? If we think of the world of Blade Runner, think of the world of Akira, and those. By the way, what I'm saying is not in the movie. The movie treats it like an end state, like a stable state, right? Society will evolve into this, and it will be like this. But yeah, it's also just a transitionary state between that and something else. And how long will it take? Who knows? But it will be different after that as well. But it's gonna be rough going through it if it's right. And what we won't get into now is like, how do we prevent cyberpunk from coming about? But I do think Akira is a movie about the fear. Like it seems to be about the fear that some people in Japan felt about the future, seeing what's happening in America, seeing what's happening to the growth of technology, seeing what's happening to the decline of Japanese traditional values and more. And like what's going to happen in a society that's like lost its foundations. This is the story of that. to me.